So Dr. Clint Mattox graduated from Purdue University with a turfgrass science degree in 2000, has been working in turfgrass industry since that time. From 2000 to 2012, Clint worked overseas on golf courses, primarily in Europe, where he was the golf course superintendent for 7 years. In 2013, he began his graduate studies at Oregon State University, focusing on managing turfgrass diseases in the absence of fungicides. Clint finished his doctorate degree in 2020, majoring in horticulture with a minor in botany and plant pathology. Currently, he is a research associate at Oregon State University, where he focuses on turfgrass research and education. So it's my pleasure to pass it over to Dr. Mattox.
Thank you, Barry. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for everybody here. There's over 300 people. That's great. So thanks again for having me speak. So I'm going to be talking about Microdochium patch. So this slide here kind of represents the disease we can see at Oregon State University towards the end of February, beginning of March. I know there's a lot of people, I recognize names from the British Columbia group that I've had a privilege to speak in British Columbia, and also some folks are able to come down and visit our site, so they're familiar with our research station. But you can just see the amount of Microdochium patch we can get in the Pacific Northwest when we're not applying fungicides. So I'm going to kind of go through some work I've been doing in 2013, and that Brian McDonald and the OSU team had started before I got here. So without further ado, we'll start to kind of introduce where we are. So this is Oregon State University. We're up here in the valley. So there's a mountain chain here called the Cascade Mountain Chain. We're west of that. So in this western region, we actually don't get snow cover very often. We actually did have some snow this past winter, or this past month for about a week, which was very rare for us. But we typically, if it does snow, doesn't stick around for more than maybe 2 or 3 days. And so in the summertime, it's probably the nicest place to live. It's super sunny and just really nice weather all throughout the 3 months of the summer. And in fact, the evenings are quite cool. So we actually don't get that much disease pressure in the summertime. Some anthracnose, some dollar spot, but not our main primary problem in turfgrass, which is basically the 9 months when our weather looks a little bit like this. So it's either foggy in the morning or it's just cool and humid. And these kinds of conditions are very conducive or very favorable to fungi. And so in particular, Microdochium nivale, the fungus responsible for Microdochium patch, really does fine anytime above freezing. And in fact, it can grow really well at 20 degrees Celsius. But we typically see disease when it's about 0 to 10 degrees Celsius. And so that's very, very typical for us to be in that temperature parameter from probably sometime around October until into March. And then on the shoulder months of September, April, and May, we can get disease as well, especially just in the shade. And those temperatures are very favorable in the mornings and towards the end of the evening. And in fact, it's really humid here, right? We get a lot of rain. It's known for rainfall in the Pacific Northwest. And our leaves are maintained wet for more than 24 hours. And even when we mow, we're basically displacing the wetness as opposed to actually having the leaves dry out. It doesn't actually often get dry enough to do that. Our turf grasses here are very susceptible to Microdochium patch. I know many people on the call, of course, most of you, I assume, are in Canada. And in Canada, you probably have a lot of annual bluegrass putting greens like we do. So these are, of course, wild biotypes. Very few people are actually sowing a improved variety of annual bluegrass. And the limited amount of annual bluegrass that is sold on the market that I'm aware of doesn't have any differences in annual or in Microdochium patch susceptibility. So we, of course, maintain fabulous golf course conditions on annual bluegrass, minus the seed head issues. But these grasses are extremely susceptible to Microdochium patch. The fungus, of course, is Microdochium nivale. Many people who've been working in the industry, even myself, when I learned about this fungus as a superintendent, was called Fusarium nivale. The name has changed in the last couple of decades. And sometimes you'll see it written as Monographella nivalis, which is the teleomorph or the sexual stage of the fungus. This fungus makes a lot of mycelium, a lot of spores, and it spreads quite easily from, and at least in our area, from September well into April. And we can streak on the green as well. It just, the mower will just drag those mycelium across the green, either carrying spores with it or just breaking up the mycelium as it goes. And then that enters into the plant. And so this is kind of the disease pressure we'll see on, this is actually a trial we did on nitrogen and iron sulfate rates. And one thing we like to do, at least in the research when I was doing a graduate degree, is because this was such new information, trying to look at managing Microdochium patch, we actually beat up the grass with golf shoes. So we would walk over the turf to replicate 76 golf rounds a day. And so we would do that actually, and you can see us with our umbrellas because it was basically raining all the time. We would walk across those plots to try to beat them up to see if these treatments would be able to not only suppress Microdochium patch, but also to maintain good turf grass quality. And you can actually see here in the foreground, I think you can see my little cursor or hand here. These are former treatments. These are from this video is from a couple years ago, but these are basically iron sulfate that's been applied. You can see the darkening here. And we're going to get into that in a little bit later. Over here's where we were using mineral oils, sulfur and phosphorus acid, and then over here as well, mineral oil, sulfur and phosphorus acid. We have a lot of research going on in this realm. And the reason why we're doing this research is not because we don't have fungicides. We actually do have quite a bit of fungicides that suppress Microdochium patch. However, we have already seen fungicide resistance in the Pacific Northwest against a couple chemistries, particularly thiophanate methyl and iprodion. And there is reports of strobilurin and possibly other fungicide resistance. So there's a lot of interest in looking into alternatives to disease control. And my primary interest when I came to graduate school is I was a golf course superintendent in France, and there will no longer be fungicides allowed on golf courses as of 2025. And when I left France in 2013, it was actually supposed to be earlier, 2020. So they have extended that time a little bit, but that was kind of the motivation to look into this disease because it's the most important disease we had in France. And in fact, the most important we have in Oregon, or at least the west of the Cascades. And so things we've looked at in the past, we looked at cultural controls such as rolling, and we found that that did suppress disease, but not completely, just some disease suppression when used alone. We looked at alternative products such as trichoderma, which is a fungus biocontrol product. We're going to talk a lot today about phosphorus acid, specifically in my presentation and Brian's, looking at the products that we've been using with phosphorus acid. We've used sulfur alone to suppress Microdochium patch. We've used mineral oils. When I came to graduate school, Civitas Turf Defense, I believe it was called Civitas 1 at the time, was the only labeled mineral oil. And so that's what we were using. And then we also use iron sulfate. And so one thing that we kind of a novel thing we learned in the research during the 2013 to 2020, during my graduate research is sulfur by itself, phosphorus acid by itself will suppress Microdochium patch compared to a not treated control. However, when we combine them, we actually get a pretty good additive effect. And these are novel information coming out of these research projects. And we found the same to be true when we would use mineral oil by itself. It would suppress Microdochium patch significantly compared to a not treated control. However, when it was combined with phosphorus acid, we dramatically improved the disease suppression capabilities. And finally, the same was true with iron sulfate. And so what's interesting is we have a low predictability with phosphorus acid. We often will have some trials with no disease, like phosphorus acid will completely suppress Microdochium patch. And some years we'll get 10 or more % disease, not often above maybe 12 or 15%, compared to a not treated control with maybe as much as 80 or 90% disease. So it's doing a fabulous job suppressing Microdochium patch. But we find when we combine it with other products such as sulfur, mineral oil, or iron sulfate, we get better results. And so I'm going to first talk about some observations we observed when we're using kind of the Civitas and other combination products in rotation with sulfur and phosphorus acid. Kind of when people ask me, okay, Clint, great, this is interesting research. How can I use this technology to suppress Microdochium patch on my annual bluegrass putting greens. And so the first thing I lead them to is to apply a mineral oil. So down here in this plot in the bottom left here, the idea would be to apply a mineral oil in combination with phosphorus acid, and then 2 weeks later, apply a combination of sulfur and phosphorus acid, and then return back to the mineral oil and phosphorus acid, and then back and forth. So the greens would be receiving mineral oil, in this case, once a month. And the reason why we recommend this is to try to reduce the amount of mineral oil we're using in the winter time on our annual bluegrass putting greens. Because when we're beating them up with our golf shoes, we were observing, especially when we would combine it with sulfur, but not entirely. That is to say, when we put mineral oil down every 2 weeks, so continually through the winter with foot traffic, we also saw some thinning, but not quite as bad as when we combine it with sulfur. And to give you a visualization of that, this plot up here, this is actually a photo taken from this exact plot in the exact same location. On the 9th of December, the plot looked really, really good. It actually had pretty good disease suppression, but then the turf grass actually started to thin. And this is not Microdochium patch disease. This is just thinning. This is grass leaves that are senescing. It's starting to pit. Because it's just not growing very well in the wintertime. Those potentially the stomates are being blocked by mineral oil and the gas exchange is being reduced. But as soon as the growing conditions improved, by the time February came around, the day lengths are starting to lengthen and we're starting to get better turf grass growth, and actually recovered just fine. And so we see this to a minimum extent when we use Civitas and phosphorus acid every 2 weeks. But we do recommend to kind of space out those treatments when the grass is not growing. So one technique we did was to alternate the treatments, just applying mineral oil once a month. And this is a photo taken from the exact same plots in March to give you an idea of what you can expect from the disease suppression of these techniques. So down here on the bottom left is mineral oil and phosphorus acid rotated. I already explained that one. This top left here is mineral oil and sulfur, which we do not recommend. Do not apply mineral oil and sulfur. We do not recommend that. And we've just seen some pretty clear damage. Over here in the top right is just sulfur and phosphorus acid every 2 weeks all throughout the winter. And then you can see what would happen if we did nothing here, the not treated control. So arguably we're getting, in a situation, if you were not allowed to apply traditional fungicides, these techniques would be would be simply better than having a not treated control where you'd have a lot of disease. So another way of thinking about this is to consider the growth of annual bluegrass, where in the wintertime we'll get limited growth at best, especially in the northern climates such as your own in Canada, where your day lengths, of course, are going to be shorter than ours, and the grass is potentially completely stop growth because it's frozen, the soil. And so one way that we do that is we just basically stop applying mineral oil throughout the winter time. And during those months, so we basically apply sulfur and phosphorus acid. And so the way this kind of program would work is that when September comes around and you're thinking about suppressing Microdochium patch, you could use mineral oil and phosphorus acid every 2 weeks up until the temperatures are no longer conducive for growth. In Oregon, we typically get good growth all the way till the end of November. And so what we typically would recommend is for folks to, if they're doing this other rotation, or this other basically program, is they would use only sulfur and phosphorus acid starting in December. And kind of the way that looks is if we just stop using mineral oil and phosphorus acid in the wintertime, so not in December, January, or February. So the grass isn't really growing all that well. Microdochium nivale is being suppressed fine with the sulfur and phosphorus acid during these months here, this December, January, February, or even if we extend it into March. And you can see that we're getting, as good as a fungicide control. So this would be a typical fungicide rotation. And then you can see if you did nothing, of course, you get a lot of disease. We've also looked into applying the mineral oil in December, and you still start to get some thinning, you start to get some pitting. And so we just recommend to stop applying the mineral oil. If you're using this kind of calendar program, in the month of November. Just don't apply, you just don't apply mineral oil in December. You can apply mineral oil through the month of November, but when the ground is just not conducive for growth, we would recommend just using sulfur and phosphorus acid. So that's in kind of the second technique. So we basically have two techniques. One is to just alternate where we apply mineral oil once a month. The other technique is to use mineral oil until the end of November in Corvallis anyway, and then switch over to sulfur and phosphorus acid. And then you could always modify that based on your climate. I speculate in Canada, that may be you would use mineral oil through October and then go on to a sulfur and phosphorus acid if you don't have snow cover, or perhaps you would just use the mineral oil and phosphorus acid to suppress microdochium patch before using a traditional fungicide before snow cover. These techniques do not work if you're going to get 90 days of snow cover. If you're in a gray snow mold situation or a extended snow period, these techniques will help you reduce your traditional fungicides until in that shoulder season where microdochium patch is a problem. But for pink snow mold, the residual effect is not going to be adequate for a snow cover situation of 60, 90 days or whatever. And so the last thing I'll touch upon before handing the reins over to Brian is looking at our work using iron sulfate and phosphorus acid. And so as I've indicated earlier, when we apply iron sulfate with phosphorus acid, we see a benefit. And so in this top row here, we have applied phosphorus acid, and in the bottom row, no phosphorus acid, in combination with these 5 different rates of iron sulfate. So we have either 0 kilograms of iron sulfate, and then I'm going to do my best. We typically talk about kilograms per hectare, but this is 122 grams per 100 square meters, 244, 488, and 977. And so among these 5 rates of iron sulfate, if you were to apply those alone every 2 weeks, you would get, this is a control plot, really, no iron sulfate and no phosphorus acid. And then if you were to apply those iron sulfate mixes, you would get this much suppression. These would just be indicative of that. And then we find when we apply high rates of iron sulfate, it actually thins out annual bluegrass a lot. And this is a concern, the thinning of annual bluegrass. And in fact, most people are applying a rate somewhere between 200 and 500 grams of iron sulfate. And Brian will get into some work he's been doing on that as well. And so what we find is if we mix an iron sulfate with a phosphorus acid up here in the top row, we actually find that we get a better disease suppression when we combine them. So you can actually decrease the amount of iron sulfate you get while combining it with the phosphorus acid and get equivalent levels of suppression. And so a lot of people are actually doing these kinds of techniques on golf course tees, fairways, and approaches in the United States as a way of suppressing microdochium patch adequately for a golf course fairway tee or approach in order to reduce the amount of fungicides they're applying. And so this would be a close-up image of those. Again, putting it into context, if you were to do nothing on your tee of fairway or approach, you would get a lot of microdochium patch. Of course, this would perhaps be shocking to some clients. But if you were able to, get a lower rate of iron sulfate with some phosphorus acid, again, these are every 2 weeks, and we're applying these these are being applied at 2 gallons per 1,000 square feet, which I believe is 800 liters per hectare. These here are, so I did a trial trying to figure out how to reduce the turf grass thinning by changing the water carrier volume. And so because we're getting really good disease suppression with iron sulfate and phosphorus acid, I was really interested in seeing how to change or how to improve the turfgrass density by changing water carrier volume. And what we found was that when we would use iron sulfate, so this is actually a high rate of iron sulfate applied every 2 weeks in the absence of phosphorus acid. But what we found is that when we would use a lower carrier volume, we had, again, this turfgrass thinning while we beat it up with our golf shoes. But when we increase the water carrier volume, we actually increase the density. However, it's still not going to be dense enough for a golf course putting green but it could be good enough for a tee approach or a fairway in some instances. However, we're using high volumes of water here. And this is not something that is odd for certain golf course superintendents. Actually, many golf course superintendents use big agriculture tanks and actually hand water the iron sulfate onto their greens to suppress moss or even to suppress annual bluegrass on bent grass greens in the United States. And so people are equipped to do this. It's a lot more labor to do this. And in fact, I personally think that you would be better served to combine iron sulfate with phosphorus acid and then just reduce the amount of iron sulfate to reduce the amount of thinning that you actually are observing. But the one technique is to increase your water carrier volume to increase your turfgrass density. So last slide I want to talk about is we have been using these products in a long-term trial we're starting our 4th year now. And so this will be highlighted at our Microdochium patch field day. It's been there for the last 3 years. It'll be for the 4th now. And one thing we observe in the summertime is we don't apply any fungicides where these treatments are applied. And so in this treatment, we have a sulfur and phosphorus acid rotation. We have our, that technique I was mentioning where we have mineral oil applied with phosphorus acid September through November. And then December through March, we apply sulfur and phosphorus acid and then return again to mineral oil in April. We have mineral oil and phosphorus acid rotated with sulfur and phosphorus acid. So these are the 2 treatments that we actually recommend if you're trying to use this technology to suppress microdochium patch on putting greens. And then we actually have a kind of a one I was interested in trying to reduce the amount of phosphorus acid. And then we have iron sulfate and phosphorus acid used every 2 weeks. And so this is going to be the 244 and 488 grams per 100 square meter rates every 2 weeks throughout the winter time from September through April. And so what we observe in the summer when we don't spray any fungicides at all is sometimes we get a lot of anthracnose. In this particular year, if you were in BC, you were also experiencing our wonderful heat dome. And we got an incredible amount of anthracnose this year. And what was very interesting observation is in June here, the iron sulfate treatments had anthracnose earlier and to a very serious degree. And so we found that when we had this lower rate, so this would be the 244 grams of iron sulfate heptahydrate plus phosphorus acid every 2 weeks from September to April, we found a lot more anthracnose in June. And when we increased that rate, we got even more anthracnose. So there's work that needs to be done regarding anthracnose. And so things you can do is look at the Rutgers University program, which is by far the leader on anthracnose management, where they have best management practices, including increasing nitrogen rates in the summertime, perhaps in combination with plant growth regulators to keep the growth down. And there's many techniques, increasing mowing height, top dressing, etc. But I would encourage you, if you are using these products on an annual bluegrass site, to consider that anthracnose is going to be a concern. So with that, my very last slide is here's a flyer. I just sent something out on Twitter, on my Twitter feed, and then OSU Beaver Turf Twitter feed sent it out. So March 3rd, 2022. So in 2 months, we'll be having a field day. It's a free event. We'll be eating outside, so no indoor activity at all. And there's already a lot of disease at the farm, so I think it'll be a great day. And there's my email there. If anybody has any questions, I would be delighted to answer questions. I always enjoy speaking to people who have microdochium patch issues, and it'd be my pleasure to assist. And then we have our website, beaverturf.com, which has a lot of great information as well. With that, Barry, that was my last slide, and thanks a lot.
It's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Brian McDonald. He is a senior research assistant and has been at Oregon State University for over 20 years. His responsibilities include managing the Lewis Brown Turf Center and doing applied turfgrass research. His primary areas of research have focused on fungicide fertility and plant growth regulator effects on annual bluegrass putting greens. Other areas of research include evaluating turfgrass varieties, as well as insect and weed management.
Thanks, Barry. So yeah, I'm a research assistant at Oregon State University. I've been here a long time now. Here's my picture of our wonderful microdochium patch that we get to deal with every year. I often thought about, I'm not somebody that tweets much, but I often thought about tweeting this out and say why superintendents spray fungicides or alternative products when you see this. So my job today is to go over 4 years of research that we've done using the Belchim products. And I probably have half an hour worth of talk that I'm going to condense down to 15 minutes. So my plan, and the reason I did that is because this is recorded. You can go back and pause it and look at the data in more detail. So I'm going to kind of hit the highlights, and I'll start slower and sort of explain what we've done. But part of the important part is understanding these products performance can vary based on the environmental conditions. So I'll try to set up the conditions in which those trials took place. And these were all on annual bluegrass putting greens. So hopefully it will make sense. And I'll start slower and then I'll sort of speed up as I go on, because the subsequent trials just sort of support a lot of what happened earlier, and I'll just sort of hit the highlights. So the individual products and rates we're going to look at is Fhostrol Pro, which at 130 milliliters per 100 meters squared, generally applied every 2 weeks, which is equivalent to 65 grams of phosphorus acid if you're interested. Jade mineral oil, 270 milliliters per 100 meters squared, and that was applied every 2 weeks or 4 weeks, depending on the rotation in the program. Sulfur, we use an 80% elemental product, and we used Cosavet DF. In Clint's trials, he used sulfur DF, which is a Wilbur Ellis product, and we applied it in this trial at 153 grams per meter squared every 2 or 4 weeks. And in the last year, we have 1 year of data where we're looking at iron sulfate applied at 219 grams per 100 meters squared. And we used Extreme Green 20 for that, which is a Simplot product, and it's applied every 2 or 4 weeks. And what's interesting is we haven't, Clint's done a lot of work with iron sulfate with phosphorus acid that he talked about, but we're actually started in this 1 year of data using it with the Jade mineral oil, and also in a rotation, sort of, as opposed to rotating sulfur, rotating iron sulfate. So it's a you have to be careful because it's 1 year of data, but we'll take a peek at that and we'll show you kind of what we saw with that. We also do combinations, which just the punchline is the combinations are much more effective than individual products in general. We did Fhostrol Pro and Jade, and that was applied every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks, depending on the rotation of the program. Fhostrol Pro and sulfur, and Fhostrol Pro and iron sulfate just in that last year. The rotations we did, and Clint talked a little bit about this, and this is all based on the mineral oil not wanting to apply it in cold weather and or freezing weather especially. And for us, that translates generally into fall through November. For your sites up in Canada, I imagine some of you you're gonna probably October's as late as you want to apply it. So we would make applications, Fhostrol Pro and Jade, fall through November, and then for us it was March and after that. And then in the cold weather, you'd apply Fhostrol Pro and sulfur December through February. And then the other program which Clint talked about, where you apply Fhostrol Pro every 2 weeks combined with either Jade or sulfur, so it ends up being a rotation of Fhostrol Pro and Jade, and then Fhostrol Pro and sulfur. And then the last year I mentioned we used iron sulfate, but we don't switch back and forth. So you do Fhostrol Pro and Jade, Fhostrol Pro and sulfur, Fhostrol Pro and Jade, and Fhostrol Pro and sulfur. If you were doing iron sulfate, you would just substitute the iron sulfate for the sulfur. And then our comparison treatments were propiconazole at 64 milliliters per 100 meters squared, which is 2 fluid ounces per 1,000. And that was applied every 4 weeks. So that was unique, I guess, in the sense that everything else is applied every 2 weeks. And then, of course, we had it untreated. The first year, so we'll start the first year, and this is important because it's the environmental conditions. And so the first year the trial got delayed because we had a hard time getting the products. And so I didn't want to spray, initially I didn't want to spray fungicide, so I started spraying Duraphyte and sulfur, and I made 3 applications, which turned out not to be enough. And so I kind of got burned and ended up having to remove over 500 infection centers from the plots, which I just cupped out before the trial started. But if you know that there's that many infection centers, there's also plants that are infected that aren't showing symptoms yet. So it wasn't necessarily an ideal start, especially for these types of products that I think Clint mentioned that, ideally you would start this kind of program even in September, early September, because you want to get it down before the stuff starts. So starting it now was, and I think because of that, we got the worst control this year. The other thing we did in this first year, is we did traffic 76 rounds per day, applied 5 days a week. And in all years, the treatments were applied with T-Jet flat fan nozzles at 850 liters per hectare, or 2 gallons per 1,000 square feet. So when we look at so what I've tried to do is, just for time's sake, is to simplify the data as much as I can, and just look at percent disease at the peak, and then also look at percent control. So if we look at, let me see if I can go to a pointer here, laser pointer. The first thing you always want to compare it is the untreated at the peak of disease. So we got 37%. Which actually is not too high, but if you remember, this trial we got started on December 6th, so it was late and we had all that pressure. So this is the worst control we got in all the 4 years, and you can see propiconazole had 2% disease, which translated to 95% control. And the first year I left this in here is the 1 year we actually put a low rate down, and you can see it only got 23% control, which is the worst control. So the rate does matter. The normal rate, which is 130 milliliters of Fhostrol Pro, got 71% and had almost 11% disease, which is clearly too much. And this is kind of a worst case scenario for Fhostrol Pro. And even in Clint's trials, it kind of lines up with when he's had sort of excessive pressure. And it's why I think you need to remember when you're using this, if you're trying to use these products exclusively for control, you need to mix them with something else. Jade mineral oil, the mineral oil is the strongest of the 3 individual products, and we ended up with 4% disease and 90% control, which is pretty good considering the circumstances. Of the three products, Fhostrol Pro, Jade, and sulfur, sulfur is the weakest of them, and that's, we've repeatedly seen that, which in this case we had 13% disease, which was still, compared to 37, it suppressed it. We got 64%, but it's not obviously acceptable. And then when we mixed Fhostrol Pro and sulfur was similar to Jade mineral oil by itself. Normally that would be a little bit better, but in this case. And then the best treatment was the program, which again, we applied Fhostrol Pro and Jade, and I applied it. I wanted to get 1 treatment down to the mineral oil, so the first treatment was 12/6, so I made that first treatment, and then we switched to the Fhostrol Pro and sulfur through the cold weather through February, and then when we switched back, and that was almost comparable to propiconazole applied every 4 weeks. So these products are do a good job of controlling microdochium patch. So I'm going to just sort of go through the pictures pretty quickly, just to give you an idea what the plots look like. And we had 4 reps in our trial. So what I decided to do is, instead of sort of picking one, I decided to try to pick the best plot and the worst plot, just to sort of give you the range, because what you will see is that there's, especially with individual products, is you often see pretty wide variability. So there's the untreated, there's propiconazole. It has some, even the best plots have some infection centers, and the worst one has more. So it's not perfect. Fhostrol Pro, this one looks really good. This one's has quite a bit of breakthrough on the right. Here's Jade mineral oil, and you can kind of see when you apply Jade, even in this trial, you can kind of get this lightning, which is sort of almost light abiotic damage when you're applying it every 2 weeks. And Clint talked about that, why you want to kind of rotate it. And this is with traffic on these plots. So, and then this was the worst, and you can sort of see the disease. It got disease, but it kind of held it from getting too bad. And then sulfur, like I said, is sort of the weakest of all products of the three, but still provides good suppression. And then here's a combination of Fhostrol Pro and sulfur. And then finally the rotation. So, you know, this was almost perfect control on the left, and then on the right, you can see it had some breakthrough. So then in year 2, 2018, we got delayed again getting products. The trial initiated on the 20th of November and went through April. And this year was really a dry fall and cold winter, which meant that the disease, the start of the disease was really slow. So we had no significant disease until early February. And I didn't want to get burned again, so I made a fungicide application of propiconazole plus fludeoxonil on October 6th. And then the second year, we added the treatment Fhostrol Pro plus Jade, which we didn't have in the first year. So when we look again, we want to start with the untreated. Even though we had a really slow start to the disease, we ended up getting 49% at the peak, which was in April 25th. And if we look at propiconazole, it did much better this year, only 0.5%. And if we look at Fhostrol Pro, and this is, you know, if you remember from last time, we had quite a bit of disease from Fhostrol Pro alone. This year, it did exceptionally well, which is sort of a, I guess, I don't know if I want to call it a signature, but we've seen that repeatedly with Clint's work, is that the environment makes a huge difference. Fhostrol Pro can work wonderfully if the pressure isn't too high, but if the pressure gets high, you can get 10 to even 15% disease on plots, which is why we always recommend doing combinations. And this is also unusual here. Well, Fhostrol Pro got a little bit better control than Jade. Jade, the mineral oil, is usually stronger than Fhostrol Pro, so that's unique. Sulfur again was the weakest. It only, I mean, but this is really good for sulfur by itself, only providing 2% disease for that long a period. And then as you can see, the Fhostrol Pro and sulfur was almost perfect. And then Fhostrol Pro and Jade was perfect. And then this is a little unusual too. This is, I mean, none of these are statistically significant, these differences, but the program actually was a little slightly worse than these two, which is a little unusual. But again, Fhostrol Pro and Jade applied every 2 weeks. You wouldn't want to do that because you're applying a mineral oil every 2 weeks. But in this trial, we didn't have cold enough weather where it caused a big problem. So just going through the pictures again really quickly. We've got untreated. You can see how bad it is on the right, but look at how much variability there is even in the untreated, which is what happens often with Microdochium patch, especially when you get when you have a dry fall that we sometimes get. And then propiconazole did almost perfect over here, but there was some disease. There's quite a bit of disease, probably 2 or 3% there. So it wasn't perfect. Fhostrol Pro, it's like 100% there. And here, there's a couple spots if you look in the corners and then up on the top, but did better than I would say it performed exceptionally well this year. Again, I think because of the pressure. Jade did, again, really well. You can see those pictures. There's sulfur, again, here's kind of sulfur's not as strong, so you get more variability. It did okay over here, but you can see more breakthrough. And then you do the combination products. The mixes did very well. Here's Fhostrol Pro plus sulfur, did well. And then the rotation, you actually had a little bit of breakthrough, that's probably a little unusual, but they're not perfect, so that you can get that sometimes. In year 3, This is sort of the only year of the 4 that we sort of started on time, October 7th, although like I said, Clint would recommend starting more in September, earlier September. The last date, rating date was March 11th, so we ended the trial a little earlier. And again, we had a lower percent disease of 26% untreated. And there was only 5% disease on untreated through December 18th. So that we had another dry fall. One of the keys to understanding though is there were no traditional fungicides, or nothing was applied before the trial started. So this is more of a, I guess, a true preventative trial versus the other ones were kind of, we had to apply their products ahead of time and we were late. So, and then we also changed the rotation from the warm cold rotation to alternating, the alternating one, which Clint was talking about, where you apply Fhostrol Pro with Jade, one application, and then you apply Fhostrol Pro with sulfur on the next application, then you rotate back to Fhostrol Pro and Jade and so forth. So you're applying Jade only once a month, and Fhostrol Pro gets applied, or Jade and sulfur gets applied once a month, and Fhostrol Pro gets applied every 2 weeks. So when we look at the 3rd year, again, we had 26% control on the untreated. The peak was on 311. And what we see here again is propiconazole had only 0.3%, so got really good control. And you'd expect better control because we started earlier, obviously. And Fhostrol Pro, this is kind of, if I was going to say what the normal Fhostrol Pro results are by itself, it would be somewhere between this 3% to say 6% kind of range. And I would call that if there's a normal year, we did see above 10% in the first year, which was, we were late. Whoops. Let me go back to this slide here. And Jade Mineral did very well by itself this time, which, it's not unusual, but it's probably better than it would normally do by itself. Sulfur, again, it just shows it's the weakest of the 3. When you do the combinations, this is adding sulfur in this trial didn't improve results much versus, adding sulfur with Fhostrol Pro didn't improve results much versus Fhostrol Pro by itself, which is unusual. Normally you get better results. And then you see the combination of Fhostrol Pro and Jade, which again, you wouldn't want to do that in a program because you're applying Jade Mineral unless you're going to have an incredibly moderate winter where you don't have freezing. But I think you even wanted, and then here's the rotation where you're rotating Fhostrol Pro with Jade, rotated with Fhostrol Pro and sulfur every 2 weeks, which did the best. And in this case, it actually did, these two did better than propiconazole, although that's not statistically different. So if we look at the pictures again, you can see untreated, the variability, even untreated. You can see, and I haven't talked about this, but you can see the purpling of the POA. We see this a lot with propiconazole, and I actually recommend applying a dye with it. Whether you're applying as propiconazole or as Instrata, because we get this clone separation and purpling from the growth regulator effect. And then looking at Fhostrol Pro, there was quite a bit of variability. It did pretty well on the left, and on the right, not as well. And then Jade, you see, did much better. Sulfur, again, is the worst of the individuals, but still provided very good suppression versus the untreated. And then the mix did very well. And with sulfur, not quite as well. Fhostrol Pro and sulfur, and then the rotation did really well. So it sort of supports what there's kind of a theme here. You get kind of repeating results. I did put this picture on to show sort of what happens, some of the differences. And this wasn't with traffic, but you can see the more lightning and sort of, I would call this light abiotic damage, maybe a little bit of a tip burn. I don't, with Jade applied every 2 weeks versus when it's in the rotation where it's applied monthly, you don't get that same effect. So the 4th year, this was actually more of a curative trial. It was applied January 14th. So I had to spray. I made 4 fungicide applications with the last one on 12/2. So there was a 6-week interval between when I made the last application and when the trial started. And so I ended up actually having disease at the start date. And the 2 changes we made, we substitute iron sulfate for the sulfur treatments, and we added a second formulation of Jade, which Barry can talk to you about if you have questions about that. So I put this up here. You'll probably have to spend a little more time looking at it. I'm not going to have time to go through this in detail, but I had to put this up here because you have to, when you look at the results of this, you have to compare the starting disease here with what sort of the peak is. And what's interesting is the untreated peaked on April 5th at 22%, but most of these treated plots peaked at either March 8th or March 23rd, with the exception of these iron sulfate and Phostrol iron sulfate treatments. And so I'm not going to go through all these. I'm just going to point out because most of these, I guess the take-home message with most of these products is they did really well curatively. Because if you look at some of these, they only had a slight increase in disease, starting in January. And the disease, obviously, because it's cold weather and we already had some control, it grew a lot slower to get started. But most of these products did a good job of controlling. So let's just look at the 2 formulations there wasn't really much of a difference. I mean, if you were trying to really nitpick, you might say Jade 2 was a slightly better than Jade 1, but it's so small, and with 1 year of data, I wouldn't put any stock in that. And so let's just look at the iron sulfate, because those are the new ones. So when you look at Phostrol iron sulfate, which is a treatment that Clint has done, it worked pretty well. But I don't know that, you got to deal with the blackening. I mean, it wouldn't be my first choice unless you're trying to control iron or you have a problem with spraying sulfur, which can be a problem with but it did do a pretty good job. I think what makes more sense is sort of these rotations with iron sulfate. So you're putting the iron sulfate down monthly. And it did really well when rotated with all those. So that's something that we need to take more of a look at. Clint actually hasn't looked at that either. So that's something I'm really interested in. We also mixed it with Jade, but you wouldn't want to put Jade down every 2 weeks. We didn't see, we started in January, so we didn't have enough applications to get damage. But it didn't really cause any problems. But again, I would rather, if I'm going to do this, I think I would rather apply iron sulfate every 4 weeks than every 2 weeks, just because of the problem. So I'm going to skip through these pictures because I'm running out of time. I don't want to take the time. You guys can go back and look at these. And I just want to summarize here. I have a picture here of what happened. You all know about the blackening of iron and trying to, so if you're using it, but if you're applying it every 2 weeks at that high rate, you get, obviously it's, I guess, ugly turf color. It gets too black. And then finally, this sort of the main take home messages is these products worked, very comparable to Clint's products. The results are the same, but the take-home message is the combinations and the rotations provide the best control. Fhostrol Pro and Jade, Fhostrol Pro and sulfur. I put a question mark with iron sulfate because of the problems with anthracnose and thinning, and just we need to do more work with that. And then the rotations, but the rotations are better than the individual combinations because they add safety. They limit your sulfur and iron and the abiotic damage from iron and mineral oil. So with that, I think I'll just close there.
Grover, as he's affectionately known as, began his career in turfgrass management in 1990 in Quebec at Hillsdale Golf and Country Club. After earning his diploma from the University of Guelph, he relocated to Toronto and joined the turf team at Rosedale Golf Club. And later he joined the Naldo Club, where he eventually became the assistant superintendent. More recently, Grover held an agronomic sales position with Agrium Advanced Technologies before joining Belchim Turf as our sales and account manager. So it's with great pleasure that I pass control over to Grover.
Thanks, Big Bear. Warm welcome to everyone today. Really appreciate you guys tuning in. But just in the essence of time, I'm going to jump right into my presentation here. So today we've been talking about alternative management of Microdochium patch utilizing chemistries. And essentially, there's two main forms of these chemistries we've been talking about today. And there are chemistries which, probably the easiest way to describe them are chemistries which promote like plant health, induce a systemic immune response within the plant. So we're talking about systemic acquired resistance, which is SAR, and induced systemic resistance, which is ISR. So the best way I like to describe it is I use the analogy that my former professor from Guelph, Dr. Shung, would use, is if you can just imagine a scenario where you have a castle. So if you have sprayed an ISR agent, it sends a signal to that castle. So then all your guards get their guns ready, they get the cannons, they're all loaded, their bows are armed. So they're just ready, on guard for any kind of fungal attack. So an example of a product that would do that, that would induce ISR, are mineral oils. So there's different type of ISR products. Some can be put in the soil. Products like mineral oil can be just applied on the foliage. But what's different with ISR here is that once the plant is primed and you get a fungal attack on the plant, you're really just seeing a response, in that area of fungal attack. And so that segues us into Jade. Barry alluded to at the beginning of the presentation, when we got bought by Belchim, which is a European crop protection company. What was exciting for us was when we got to look across the pond to see what kind of products they had that we could bring over. And this is one of those products we're able to bring from our new owners in Europe. So what is Jade? The cat's out of the bag now. It's a non-conventional OMRI certified fungicide. It is registered for use on golf courses, sports and athletic fields. The active ingredient, it's a white mineral oil, so it is pigment free. Here's the jug that's going to come into. It's a 20-liter jug. It is an isoparaffin oil, similar to the other industry standard that's on the market now, which is Civitas. So these types of oils are some of the purest mineral oils you can find. They're actually used in food production and pharmaceuticals, so in chapsticks, or even they're sprayed on gummy bears. So if you've opened up a bag of gummy bears, you wonder why they don't stick to each other. But if you break it in half, you can re-stick it. It's because it has these types of oils on it. And not that I'm promoting you ingest any Jade, but that's where they're used. And it's going to be launched with the suppression of Microdochium patch and dollar spot on the label. So here is the label, dollar spot at 250 to 500 milliliters in 4 to 20 liters of water, a 14-day interval. But the talk today, Microdochium patch, rate is 270 milliliters with the same water and interval. So how does Jade work? Well, it works in a couple of ways. First of all, it mimics the natural cuticle that's on the leaf blade. So it provides an extra physical barrier. So it really helps to prevent fungus from making its way inside the plant. So it would be very key to ensure that you use the right nozzles to get good coverage of the leaf blade. Then secondly, we've noticed dew suppression. So the picture on the right-hand side here was a picture that was provided to us from our friends in Europe. They'd noticed in their trials some dew suppression. We've noticed that the last couple of years when we do our small plot work. You can come back a couple of days later and pick out all the treatments that had Jade in it. So by suppressing dew, you're reducing that leaf wetness period. So if we think of the famous disease triangle, one of the components is the environmental factor. So by reducing that leaf wetness period, you're just discouraging or making an environment that's less favorable for fungal growth. And then lastly, I touched upon the ISR component. Jade is an ISR primer. So once you spray it on the leaf blade, you can once again have that effect closer to the site of a pathogen infection. So we've just seen a lot of pictures. Here's a more recent one at Jade in 2021 at 270 mils. And I thought I'd just throw out one Civitas one. I'm sure those of you who have used mineral oils before, the only product we have here as of now was Civitas. You're kind of wondering in your mind, like, how does Jade compare to Civitas? And both products have performed pretty much equally. Jade's performed as well or better. And we see maybe the slight difference would be with the pigment, the mineral oil in Civitas might help to mask some of the infection centers, but other than that, very, very comparable. So we're expecting Jade to be available in March this year. And then the other type of product we've been talking about today are products which induce SIR. So if we can imagine that scenario where you have the castle again, and after you sprayed that SIR elicitor, it sends a signal to the castle. But this time, all your soldiers just start to shoot their guns and shoot their cannons. They just go directly in attack mode. So an example of the type of product that would induce SIR is or are phosphites. So we know that phosphites can be applied in the soil or on the leaf blade. But the difference is here is you're just getting that induction across the entire plant or the leaves, despite the fact that the pathogen is just infecting it in this one spot here. So our SAR elicitor is Phostrol Pro. So what is unique about Phostrol? It's the phosphite fungicide. To my knowledge, there's no other phosphite product in the country that's got a blend of 3 different phosphite sources. It is highly concentrated at 53.6%. And we're just proud to say, for us, the feather in our cap was that Phostrol Pro is the first and only phosphite fungicide that has a Microdochium patch registration in Canada. So we look at the label. It can be used on golf courses, sports fields, sod farms, municipal, industrial, and residential turf. The suppression of Pythium blight and anthracnose has been on the label for a while now with a rate range of 130 to 260. The Microdochium patch, we're talking about 130. So we definitely have not seen a rate response above 130. So please do not go above 130 for Microdochium patch. Applied biweekly and 4 to 20 liters of water. Then I thought it'd be kind of interesting to take a look at, what exactly is this, the mechanism of suppression with phosphites on Microdochium nivale. And we definitely owe a lot of credit goes to Dr. John Dempsey in Ireland. I mean, the king of phosphite. He's done all of this work, which has helped improve our understanding of how phosphites work for Microdochium patch. So we first started in the lab. Here are 3 different culture plates. On the right-hand side, here's your control. It's filled with mycelium for Microdochium patch. In the middle is a culture plate that's been amended with phosphate. You can see there's no real response versus phosphite on the left-hand side. So while there's, chemically they seem very similar, there's only one oxygen atom that's different. You can see the difference in control. So he did note about 4 days after application of phosphite, it stopped mycelium from growing. And that effect lasted about 10 to 12 days. And then growth in this culture plate resumed again. But he did notice it was at a slower growth rate than before. He did see a rate response. So your phosphate does nothing in terms of mycelial inhibition as opposed to your phosphite. So more phosphite, more inhibition. You looked under the microscope. On the left-hand side, here's your untreated. So just some normal looking mycelium as compared to on the right-hand side here, here's mycelium that was treated with a phosphite. So you notice that it changed actual morphology of how the mycelium grew. Ended up with more of a stunted, kind of rounded growth here. And he did note that when the morphology was changed, the pathogen would release these stress metabolites. So his conclusion in the lab was that phosphites do in fact inhibit mycelial growth and conidial germination, which are the reproductive structures of the pathogen. It disrupted that hyphal morphology and caused that release of stress metabolites. So that's one thing to see and notice something in the lab, but how about in the plant? How about in the field? And you noticed the exact same thing, that in a plant that was treated with phosphite when it was infected with Microdochium patch, and the phosphite came into contact with the pathogen, it did change the morphology of the mycelium, which resulted in that stunted growth. It released those stress metabolites, and at the end of the day, just allowed for faster recognition by the plant that it was under fungal attack. So that's one thing. He then wanted to see, okay, well, we take it for granted that, you hear a lot of people say that phosphites elicit SAR. And if I can evoke my best impression of Dr. Joe Vargas, he talks a lot about like folklore in the business about how POA dies in the heat. So Dr. Dempsey wanted to see, is this just some more folklore? So he took a closer look, and in uninfected plants, he definitely did notice an increased amount of these phenolic compounds, which are early defense compounds. So whether it was POA annua or creeping bentgrass, in those uninfected plants that were treated with phosphite, just more phenolic compounds as compared to plants that were treated with phosphate and the control. And then hydrogen peroxide, which is one of those early defense compounds, did notice an increase in concentration at the infection sites. So all these areas that are stained blue, those were the infection sites and more of this early defense compound. So, okay, that's one thing. So how about in uninfected, infected plants? We see here, same thing, the phenolic compounds. There was more phenolic compounds. The red bars are all the plants that were amended with phosphite. You saw the exact same thing. So his conclusions were that phosphates have both a direct and an indirect mode of action. So it does actually impact the pathogen, it stunts its growth, changes its morphology. Phosphates do indeed elicit SAR. And in his estimation, it's actually this indirect mode of action. So the SAR is the main contributor to the suppression of Microdochium patch. And then, so here's a couple pictures of Fhostrol Pro really quickly. And this kind of echoes what Brian was talking about, how you do see a little variability from year to year. And I just want to quickly segue into BioPriority, which is a couple of years ago as a company, where we decided to start to invest more of our resources in more of these low-risk biorational options. Actually, our goal is to have 10% of our portfolio be these low-risk biorational options. So we came up with a term which we trademarked as BioPriority. So BioPriority is a term that we use to describe our lower risk biorational portfolio, but also we're creating BioPriority solutions. So, two types of solutions, either one solution that utilizes 100% of these BioPriority products, or more of a hybrid program where we're trying to use these lower risk products to lower the total active ingredient load of synthetic fungicides. But what is key is that, that we do that without compromising turf quality and the performance that your members or clientele expect at your facility. So a quick look at our BioPriority portfolio. We just spent the last 50 minutes talking about Jade and Phostrol Pro. The fairway snake we've had for a long time. That's just our dew removal rope. We talk about that environmental factor, reducing the leaf wetness period to have less fungal growth. Munger's Plus, which is our non-selective horticultural vinegar. And then Trizay, which is a newer addition, something that's still somewhat in development. It's now available, but we're still kind of looking at it. It's a combination, to my knowledge, it's the only combination product of both mycorrhizae and trichoderma in one bag. It is a dry formulation. And also what I think is unique about it is that the beneficial fungi in this product come from spores as opposed to propagules. So here is our first, very proud to introduce our first BioPriority solution for Microdochium patch, which is Phostrol Pro and Jade. So in conclusion, how can you utilize these products? You can use them exactly the way that Dr. Mattox and Brian have been talking about them. They can be used independently, or you can put them, tank mix them in rotations, such as the Gold Star rotation that Dr. Mattox was referencing, Phostrol Pro with Jade, and you alternate that with sulfur. Or if you're not comfortable using sulfur, you can use some iron instead. Just want to, so if you have any more questions, by all means, feel free to reach out to any of our partners across the country. Just want to thank them. If you're interested in any of our products, feel free to reach out to a retail partner closer to you. You could always reach out to me as well. Here's my contact info, my cell phone. You can call me on weekends. My phone's on 24/7. If you feel too shy to call me on the weekend, send me a text. If you're on Twitter, please give us a follow at Belchim Turf. We definitely appreciate that. If you're more familiar with a Big Bear or a BJ, here's their email address. Feel free to reach out to them as well. With that, just want to thank you very much and open it up to questions.
Sure, yeah.
If there's been any long-term impacts with repetitive applications of phosphates, iron, and sulfur?
Yeah, so one of the big concerns, so one of the advantages actually is we're doing this long-term trial. It's starting the 4th year, and at the end of every year, we take soil samples. And so we can quantify basically most of the macro and micronutrients as well as pH. And kind of the big takeaways is we haven't really seen a dramatic drop in pH, like not a significant difference in the pH, although we would speculate that sulfur and iron sulfate would decrease the pH over time. So we definitely tell people to monitor that and to, lime if the pH does become a concern. One thing that is interesting is that phosphorus acid treatments that receive phosphorus acid have shown an increase in phosphate availability over time. So it's kind of acting as a slow release phosphorus product in many ways, because phosphates are known to not be readily available to the plant as a nutrient source of phosphorus. And in fact, if you're phosphorus deficient, can cause a problem with phosphorus, because the plant actually thinks it's taking up phosphorus when it's not taking up an available form. But the moral of the story is good news. If you have adequate phosphorus, you apply phosphates, which is a kind of the trade terminology for phosphorus acid. We have shown that the phosphate levels go up. So if you are including phosphorus acid in your program, you may be able to decrease your phosphorus fertilization. So that's a positive benefit, I think. And I think somebody else asked a question, just general. Just to recap, we are doing, so Brian and I both are using elemental sulfur. I've actually, sulfur DF is actually no longer sold by Wilbur Ellis. So I'm using the exact same sulfur as Brian is using now, but they're 80% elemental sulfur products. And I think that in Canada at one point it was like called Cumulus DF or something, but it's basically just elemental sulfur product.
Somebody asked whether Jade causes a short-term growth rate jump like Civitas, and I haven't measured the growth rate. I know what you're talking about with Civitas. My impression is it doesn't, and I think it's likely, I mean, this is just my guess. It's not, I think it's related, the Civitas growth rate jump is related to the pigment. But that's just, like I said, I haven't measured it, so that's just my impression right now. But I haven't observed it either with Jade in the trials that I've done. Somebody's asking, what about through the summer? I'm unable to apply anything from November to March due to snow coverage, so I'm trying to find something to use through the summer, if not just the shoulder. Clint, do you want to talk about that? Or, I mean, I assume what you're saying is you're in a climate that, Jonathan, in a climate that where you get microdochium patch in the summer. I know phosphates are also applied in the summer for anthracnose, but I'm guessing you mean for microdochium patch. Is that correct?
Yeah. All right. So, I mean, basically, I would, as long as your temperatures are conducive for microdochium patch, I think that, using these kinds of rotations would be certainly adequate. I don't know, Brian, have you, I mean, people are using Civitas in the summertime as well. So I haven't personally done that research. Brian may have used Civitas.
Yeah, we just did some last year, and yeah, you can do that. The only product I would stay away from is the iron sulfate because of the heat and the blackening. Sulfur, I'd be a little bit more careful of the sulfur, just because, I mean, you have to keep track of your total sulfur, but if you've got anthracnose, I'd worry about the total sulfur, but I think certainly phosphorus acid, Phostrol Pro and Jade would be, and you're not worried about Jade in cold weather. So I think it would do fine in the summertime.
Yeah, we haven't found a solution for gray snow mold yet. So we'll work, we need to work on that, but yeah, November to March have snow covers, a lot of snow covers. That's a great site for gray snow mold.
Without further ado, just want to again thank Dr. Mattox and Mr. McDonald, Grover, and everyone for taking the time to sign on today. And we'll bid you a wonderful day.